Today we highlight another bad doctor. This one has war crimes. Hi, I'm Dr. Dre, board certified internist, and in this segment we talk about infamous, notorious figures who happen to also be doctors. Today, the person of interest is Bashar al-Assad. Yes, you heard me right. I'm talking about the Syrian dictator. And believe it or not, he's also formerly known as Dr. al-Assad.
Bashar al-Assad was the London-trained eye doctor who became one of the world's most ruthless dictators.
So what we're going to do is take a dive into a little bit of his history, talk about his medical career before he was a dictator, and then talk about how some physicians interact with him, or at least try to interact with him to try to save humanity. So let's get into it. So again, let's make sure that we're all on the same page. We're talking about Bashar al-Assad, heir to the Syrian ruling dynasty, son of former autocratic leader Hafez al-Assad. Now, Bashar al-Assad did turn his presidency into a family business. He clenched power through repression, mass surveillance, and is responsible for brutal violence throughout the Syrian civil war. His regime is accused of war crimes, using weapons against humanity, and again, brutal torture.
Despite initial promises of human rights reforms, little progress occurred after Assad took office. In 2006, the Syrian government increasingly used torture, violence, and travel bans on activists and critics to silence dissent. By 2007, a presidential referendum was held without any opposition candidates, cementing Assad's uncontested hold on power. In November 2011, Syria was thrown out of the Arab League over its deadly repression of anti-government protests, and by June 2012, the UN declared a full-scale war in Syria.
Over the next 13 years, Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, would lead a vicious bombing campaign in opposition-held northern Syria. The war left an estimated 500,000 Syrians dead and 14 million displaced.
Now, as the world turned against him, against his atrocities, he relied heavily on Putin to back him and to help him for his survival. Now, more recently, through geopolitical shifts and recent conflicts, the Syrian rebels were able to topple the al-Assad regime. And now the former dictator and former doctor is hiding in Russia. Now you know a little bit about the background. Let's talk about Dr. al-Assad. Again, the former dictator. He was born in 1965 in Damascus, and he was the second son of former president Hafez al-Assad. And he was the second in line for the presidency. First in line was his brother Bashar, and he was being groomed to be the next president. And for all accounts, Bashar, the dictator, had no desire for any kind of political role or any kind of political leadership. He was known to be reserved and very studious, and this is most likely why he decided to pursue medicine. So he studied at the University of Damascus, and in 1988, he graduated from the University of Damascus. He decided to pursue a specialty in ophthalmology in London, and from all reports, he was bright, kind, soft-spoken, and reserved. It seems that Bashar al-Assad would have continued on this path if it wasn't for a specific incident. And this was the death of his brother in 1994. Again, his brother was pitted for the role of the next president, and when he died in a car accident, guess what? Bashar al-Assad was recalled to Syria. So he stopped his training in ophthalmology and was told to come back to Syria. And he was quickly put into leadership. In fact, he was placed in charge of the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. So just like that, he went from being a doctor to being a military leader. Now, he continued through the regime, and in 2000, with the death of his father, he was placed as president of Syria. And quickly, his brutality grew. He began to crack down all over Syria. But what really displayed his brutality was during the Arab Spring in 2011. And they saw more arrest, more torture, and more mass displacement of people. So again, I wish to highlight now more of the medical interactions that al-Assad did have. And I think it was the fact that he was a former physician that the greater medical community did try to speak to his humanity. Several physicians did try, directly or indirectly, to take steps to intervene, and there's several I can talk about. There was Dr. Ann Sparrow, who was a pediatrician and a public health expert, and she was a very outspoken critic against al-Assad and his atrocities, and she documented the war crimes and called for global pressure against the regime.
That inspired me to then work in this field. I got my Master's of Public Health, and since then worked in a series of of countries in conflict, including Syria.
There was Dr. Zahir Shalvu, who was a Syrian American physician, and he's a former president of the Syrian American Medical Society, and he lobbied for protection of healthcare workers in Syria and did really advocate for humanitarian access to the people in Syria. There's also Dr. Mahmoud Fakhri, who is the former WHO regional director for Eastern Mediterranean, and he did try to improve healthcare during the war for those people. Now, one of the most known doctors during this whole conflict or their interactions with Bashar al-Assad was a doctor called Dr. David Nott.
I wasn't quite sure who they were, but we were about halfway through this operation and suddenly the doors of the operating theatre burst open and the operating theatre was full of men dressed in black, all with Kalashnikovs, which I suddenly had a cold shiver down my spine to realise that they were from ISIS.
And he had more interaction with Dr. Bashar al-Assad, or the dictator Bashar al-Assad. So I'm going to introduce Dr. David Nott. He's a general surgeon as well as a vascular surgeon. And he had happened to meet Bashar al-Assad during his training in London. Now, more impressively, he's partially responsible for the negotiation in the ceasefire with the Assad regime in the Battle of Aleppo in 2016. Now, David Nott, by chance, again, did meet him while he was training in 1993. And this is before he was recalled to Syria. Their meeting took place in Western Eye Medical Center, or Western Eye Hospital in London. They had happened to have a conversation about a different Syrian doctor, and at that time, he was unaware that Dr. al-Assad was the son of the president. Now, 2 decades later, by happenstance, British intelligence did make a note that they did meet. Now, in 1996, Dr. Nott was working in Syria at the time with other physicians, and the areas surrounding them were being bombarded by Russian forces. Now, through back channels, the British Secret Intelligence or British Security Service was able to put them in contact. So they put Dr. Nott in contact with the president's regime. And through several calls, he was able to help negotiate a ceasefire in December of 2016. And this allowed for safe passage of some of the physicians as well as some of the people who were in the area. Overall, I think this highlights how physicians and medical professionals can advocate beyond their normal duties. Yes, there's one thing to take care of patients, but they went above and beyond to try to speak to greater humanity. In conclusion, Dr. al-Assad had his journey from being a former doctor to a dictator, and that story is pretty chilling. And his medical background, normally you would hope, would prevent him from committing such atrocities. But history doesn't show that this happened. And overall, it just speaks to getting down to the essence of who we are as people and moving forward in humanity. And I think it also shows that doctors have a responsibility beyond just their patients and to help the world in general. Until next time.